Hello again, everyone. Back for more of Chapter 11 in Chaos by Tom O'Neill. Let's get into it. Limited time, so I'll try not to blabber on in the beginning like I did yesterday. All right, so the next section, it's hard for me to tell. I'm just looking at my laptop and not holding the actual book in my hand. So I feel like I don't have a good grasp of how much is left of this chapter. There can't be too much more left, right? I feel like we've been in this chapter for a long time. All right, the next section is called Jack Ruby's Psychotic Break. Is our Kennedy connection? I feel like there's a Kennedy connection in every book we do. There definitely is so far. Okay, so at UCLA, I kept requesting boxes of West papers, and they kept leading me over trapdoors. Next, they dropped me into a quagmire I wanted no part of. The assassination of John F. Kennedy, an event that plausibly qualified as the most discussed crime of all time. I think that's true. I love reading about all the theories and stuff. I don't know, I kind of have my own, but then I go back and forth. I definitely think LBJ had something to do with it. Onward. I said no tangents. Certainly, it had bred more conspiracy theories, skepticism, and enmity than any other incident in U.S. history, altering the way Americans digested their news and breaking the nation's belief in its institutions. Well, this book, Chaos, if this doesn't break your belief in American institutions, I'm not sure what would. I flipped through West's pages cautiously, hoping that his involvement was peripheral. It wasn't. Down through the trapdoor I went. He calls them trapdoors, I call them rabbit trails, but I'm guilty of meandering through them, as you all know. Kennedy was shot as his motorcade passed through Dallas's Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963. 2 days later, at the Dallas Police Headquarters, officers escorted Kennedy's alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, to an armored car that would drive him to the county jail. A man stepped out from the crowd and aimed a revolver at Oswald's chest. It was Jack Ruby, a nightclub proprietor with connections to Cuban political groups and organized crime. He fired once at point-blank range, sending a fatal bullet into Oswald's stomach. We've all seen that, right? Here's our little footage of that. According to a first-person account that Ruby produced with a ghostwriter, published in newspapers, in a scenario close to Susan Atkins, and again involving Lawrence Schiller. That's weird, right? These connections. He lost his senses when he pulled out his gun. Next thing he knew, the cops had him pinned to the floor, and he had no memory of what he'd just done. Same as Zirhan, right? Same era as well. "What am I doing here?" he asked. "What are you guys jumping on me for?" A psychiatric analysis solicited by Ruby's defense attorneys said he'd suffered a fugue state with subsequent amnesia. Manchurian Candidate, anyone? You guys watch that movie yet? I'm sure most of you have. It's not a new movie, but it's a good one. Some people call it propaganda. I was just reading something that's like, that movie's propaganda. I don't know. Tell me what you think about that. On the advice of his attorney at the time, Ruby said he'd murdered Oswald to spare the widowed First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, the ordeal of testifying against Oswald at trial. Another of Ruby's attorneys, Melvin Belli, later wrote that Ruby had a blank spot in his memory and that any explanation he provided was simply confabulating. Potential justifications had been poured like water into the vacuum in his pathologically receptive memory, and once there, had solidified like cement. Seemingly, as soon as the story of Oswald's murder hit the presses, Jolly West tried to insinuate himself into the case. He hoped to assemble a panel of experts in behavior problems to weigh in on Ruby's mental state. He took the extraordinary measure of approaching Judge Joe B. Brown. Yes, that one. Remember Joe Brown, Judge Joe Brown? That was like a show. Not that long ago, and I actually saw him on Candace Owens, probably a year ago now, a while ago, talking about this. pretty interesting. It was very interesting. I'll see if I can find the episode. This has been a while ago. So Judge Joe Brown, who impaneled the grand jury that indicted Ruby, West wanted the judge to appoint him to the case. At that time, police hadn't revealed any substantial information about Ruby, his psychological condition, or his possible motive. And West was vague about his motive too. 3 documents among his papers said he'd been asked by someone, though he never said who, to seek the appointment from Brown a few days after the assassination, a fact never before made public. I think O'Neill's saying he's making this fact public. The judge turned him down. For the moment, it seemed West would be getting nowhere near Ruby, who was soon convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Ruby was reportedly unmoored by the news. He'd killed the president's assassin, and the citizens of Dallas had rewarded him with a trip to the gallows. Well, what did you think was going to happen? You murder someone, you think you're going to have a parade held in your honor or something? Murder is murder. No one's above the law. That's so weird to even think that you would be spared any kind of, it's equal justice, right? Equal justice. Although some of these people seem to be above the law. Maybe he thought that would be him too. Okay. He fired his attorney and hired Hubert Winston Smith, a psychiatrist with a law degree who'd assisted in the trial to represent him on appeal. He fired his attorney and hired a psychiatrist. Oh, a psychiatrist with a law degree who'd assisted at the trial. That makes more sense. Meanwhile, at Langley, the CIA's Richard Helms was making the case that MKUltra's human guinea pigs had to be entirely unaware of the experiments performed on them. This was the only realistic method, he wrote, to influence human behavior, as the operational targets will certainly be unwitting. So that makes you wonder, with Sirhan, with Jimmy Shaver, with Jack Ruby, if this is saying that they have to be entirely unaware of the experiments, does that absolve them? I don't know. Maybe not absolve, but I don't know. It's a tricky question, because if someone's mind is broken and can be manipulated at any time, and you set them free because it wasn't technically their fault, they've been programmed to do it, who's to say they aren't going to be programmed to do more of the same in the future? I don't know. What do you guys think? What do you think? I don't know. It's a great area, I guess. Once Dr. Smith was driving Ruby's legal team, one of his first acts was to request a new psychiatric examination of Ruby. He had one candidate in mind, Dr. Louis Jolion West, whom he noted in a court brief had enjoyed acclaim for his studies of brainwashed American POWs. Perhaps, Smith wrote, West could use his highly qualified skills as a hypnotist and an administrator of true serum, sodium pentothal, to help Ruby regain his memory of the shooting. West may have rewarded Smith for the plum assignment by helping him land a teaching position at Oklahoma. So this sounds like a you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back possible situation, where West wanted to do this and Smith tried to help him get it so he could also get a teaching position. So much corruption, that's all I have to say. And so on April 26, 1964, West boarded a plane bound for Dallas. He was scheduled to examine Jack Ruby in the county jail that afternoon. The Dallas papers reported it in their final editions that evening. West emerged from Ruby's cell to announce that the previously sane inmate had undergone an acute psychotic break sometime during the preceding 48 hours. Whatever transpired between West and Ruby in that cell, only the two of them could say. There were no witnesses. How convenient. West asserted that Ruby was now positively insane. The condition appeared to be unshakable and fixed. That's terrifying. I mean, you can just go in a room with somebody. I don't know how long they said he was in there. No, it doesn't. Not for very long. I mean, an hour, 2 hours. How long would you how long would it take to do a psychiatric evaluation? A day? I don't know. But in that short period of time, your brain can be allegedly broken to the point of being unshakable and fixed in a psychotic break kind of situation. Ugh. In a sworn affidavit accompanying his diagnosis, West described a completely unhinged man who hallucinated, heard voices, and had suddenly acquired the unshakable belief that a new Holocaust was underway in America. What? Last night, West wrote, the patient became convinced that all Jews in America were being slaughtered. This was in retaliation for him, Jack Ruby, the Jew who was responsible for all the trouble. What in the world? The delusions were so real that Ruby had crawled under the table to hide from the killers. He said he'd seen his own brother tortured, horribly mutilated, castrated, and burned in the street outside the jail. Now, are these images being inserted into his mind? You have to ask yourself. If so, that's horrible. He could still hear the screams. The orders for this terrible pogrom must have come from Washington. West said the trouble had started sometime in the evening before the exam, when Ruby ran headfirst into his cell wall in an apparent suicide attempt. But Ruby's jailer, Sheriff Bill Decker, shrugged it off as a cry for attention. He rubbed his head on the wall enough that we had to put a little merthiolate, which is a kind of antiseptic, on it, Decker told a reporter. That's all. From that day forward, every doctor who examined Ruby made similar diagnoses. He was delusional. West, however, was hardly the first to have evaluated him. By then, nearly half a dozen psychiatrists, many equally renowned, had taken stock of Ruby's condition, finding him essentially compos mentis, which means, I'm pretty sure, compos mentis. Let's put it up here. I think that means he is sane. West had been briefed on these opinions, but in his hubris, he wrote that he'd hardly bothered with them, having been unable to read them until earlier today on the airplane. Tonight, my own findings make it clear that there has been an acute change in the patient's condition since these earlier studies were carried out. In other words, I'm right, everyone else is wrong. The change was too acute for Judge Brown's liking. In the preceding 5 months, he'd spent many hours in the courtroom with Ruby, and he never witnessed anything resembling the behavior West described. Presumably, it wasn't lost on him that this was the same doctor who'd clamored to see Ruby months earlier. Joe Brown is no dummy. After the judge heard West's report, he ordered a second opinion, saying, I would like some real disinterested doctors to examine Ruby for my own benefit. I want to get the truth out of it. Which is what every judge should say, if we're being honest. The opinion came from Dr. William Beavers, who examined Ruby 2 days after West. Beavers' report to the judge, never before made public, confirmed West's findings. Ruby became agitated, Beavers wrote, and asked if I did not hear the sounds of torture that were going on. Like Judge Brown, he was alarmed by the abruptness of Ruby's disintegration. He considered the possibility that Ruby was malingering, which I think that's probably what Joe Brown thought with Ruby, or not with Ruby, sorry, with West, that he was maybe just a corrupt guy who was trying to get him off on like an insanity plea. But it seems more like he went in and just broke his brain somehow, and that he's seeing all these visions, which we've heard it was kind of his goal to figure out how to remove memories, implant new ones. And then the whole, was he a Manchurian candidate type guy to begin with? We're never going to know, but it's fascinating to think about. See, quickly ruled it out, explaining that it was highly unlikely that this individual could have convincingly faked hallucinations. Beavers wondered if Ruby had been tampered with or drugged by an outsider, maybe the one that was there 2 days prior. The possibility of a toxic psychosis could be entertained, he wrote, but is considered unlikely because of the protected situation. Not really, if someone was just in there with no witnesses 2 days before, and then suddenly all these hallucinations were happening. The truth by that point was sealed up behind West. Beavers couldn't have known that one of his fellow caregivers was capable of anything so diabolical as inducing mental illness in a patient. Well, if he'd known anything about his previous research, he would know that that's exactly the kind of thing that he did in his labs. Induced mental illness. His reports would have turned out differently, no doubt, if he'd been apprised of West's unorthodox fortes and his long relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency. Dozens of West colleagues offered me assessments of his character. There was praise, especially from those who'd worked with him at UCLA, but there was also condemnation, most of it from his former colleagues at Oklahoma, where he'd done the bulk of his MK Ultra research. He was a devious man, egotistical, an inveterate narcissist, and womanizer. Have you guys seen this guy? Who is he womanizing? That's me being judgmental, but he's not the most attractive bloke. Okay, the few who hadn't already suspected his involvement with the CIA accepted it readily. But the most relevant insight came from Dr. Jay Shirley, his good friend of 45 years, who'd worked with West at Lackland Air Force Base and the University of Oklahoma. Shirley was one of the few colleagues who admitted that West was an employee of the CIA. I asked him if he thought West would have accepted an assignment from the CIA to scramble Jack Ruby's mind. I feel sort of disloyal to Jolly's memory, Shirley said, but I have to be honest with you. My gut feeling would be yes, he would be capable of that. Calling West a very complex character, he explained he had a little problem with grandiosity. He would not be averse at all to having influenced American history in some way or other. So he just wants, I don't know if you could call it glory for breaking someone's mind, but I guess if you're a scientist and that you're considering that being, a great scientific thing to do that's going to really truly affect history. I mean, imagine if Ruby had not had his mind broken, we might have found out other things in his trial that may completely have changed what we thought about. Would we all still be talking about the Kennedy assassination, or would we have answers that we have more answers? We probably would, I think. But people are going to protect themselves. Agencies are going to protect themselves if they're complicit, right? Whether he got the credit for it or not. Jolly had a real streak of, I guess you call it patriotism. That's patriotism. The president asked him to do something, or somebody in a higher office, he would break his back to do that without asking too many questions. So it said if the president asked him to do something. So could Lyndon Johnson? That's the new president, right? I don't know. I don't like Lyndon Johnson, even though he's my cousin. And I do believe he had the most to gain from it, but there's so many factors in the JFK assassination. So many people that, with the Bay of Pigs stuff and so many things. We're never going to know. I still study it a lot because I find it fascinating, but we're never going to know. Let's be honest. Any evidence that's out there, that was out there, it's gone. It's gone, guys. I just have to come to terms with that. I thought with that records dump that we would have learned more, but not really. So far, not. I mean, I haven't read through it all, but there are people reading through it all, and nothing earth-shattering's come out that I'm aware of at this point. Even if it meant distorting American history, I suppose so, Shirley said. He was a pretty fearless kind of guy. Okay, so that's the end of that section. Sorry, I should have read that and then wrapped it up, but I didn't know. Like I said, reading it on this platform is a little different than actually holding the book in my hand. All right, the next section is called A Deliberate Gangland Killing. West's fearless intervention set the stage for decades of confusion and conspiracy in Washington. Like I said, it's still everything's an unknown. A week after Kennedy's assassination, the newly installed president, Lyndon Johnson, hand-selected a group of 13 men to investigate the crime. The Warren Commission. What a loadable that whole thing was. The President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, better known as the Warren Commission, after its chairman, Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, had some dubious members in its ranks. One was Allen Dulles. Oh my gosh, that guy's a rabbit trail. I should go down that rabbit trail with you guys if you want. That guy's a piece of work. Former CIA director. Kennedy had fired him 2 years earlier after he'd bungled the Bay of Pigs invasion. See, okay, I don't want to get down the Kennedy assassination rabbit hole, but Tom O'Neill's forcing my hand. I heard that Allen Dulles, even though he'd been fired 2 years prior by Kennedy, which is another one of those, like, was Dulles in on it? I heard that he was actually in, they said, at the farm, which is basically CIA headquarters, when Kennedy was assassinated. He had no business being there. It was 2 years after he was fired. So that's another little question mark in the tangled web of the Kennedy assassination. Okay, onward. Another was the official CIA liaison to the group, Richard Helms, soon to become the agency's director. A protege of Dulles, Helms was a longtime secret employer of Jolly West and one of the few agency officials aware of MKUltra. But no one else on the commission, except presumably Dulles, who started the program. So Dulles started the program. I wasn't sure if it was Gottlieb or Dulles, but whatever. It's a whole bag of psychopaths, if you ask my opinion. Okay, so no one else on the commission was aware that a CIA asset trained in mind control had assumed responsibility for the psychiatric care of Jack Ruby, whom the commission regarded as their most important witness. So much corruption. In June 1964, Earl Warren and others from the group flew to Dallas to give Ruby a hearing in the interrogation room of the county jail. The bulk of his testimony was a morass of paranoid rambling. He begged Warren to get him out of Dallas. The Jewish people are being exterminated at this moment, he warned. I know I won't live to see you another time. Do I sound sort of screwy? He demanded to speak with a Jew, whispering frantically, "You have to get me to Washington. They're cutting off the arms and legs of Jewish children in Albuquerque and El Paso." And was he just crazy, or did these weird things get inserted into his mind? The commission, unable to extract a cogent account from their main witness, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in assassinating Kennedy. Once again, I've said it before, no way, no chance in heck. And that Ruby did not act in a conspiracy to silence Oswald. Although they saw no evidence of a secret plot, they couldn't definitively rule out such a thing. But their integrity was compromised the minute West set foot in Ruby's jail cell. The group was required to investigate the CIA as a routine suspect in the assassination of a sitting president. Neither Dulles nor Helms ever reported their knowledge of West's employment by the CIA. And soon Jack Ruby was no longer around to tell his own story. He died in 1967 of complications from lung cancer. In the 70s, when Congress looked into abuses by intelligence agencies, it found evidence that the CIA and FBI had obstructed the Kennedy investigation. Dulles and Helms had deliberately concealed failed CIA plots to assassinate Cuba's dictator, Fidel Castro. Allegedly, the CIA had aligned with organized crime figures, many sworn enemies of President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. They teamed up with anti-Castro Cubans in Miami and New Orleans to assassinate the dictator. Helms had personally overseen those schemes. So Helms was on the Warren Commission? I mean, there's so much conflict of interest with just those two being on the Warren Commission. The evidence, wrote House officials, impeaches the process by which the intelligence agencies arrived at their own conclusions about the assassination. Feeling it had no choice but to start over again, the House voted overwhelmingly to impanel the House Select Committee on Assassinations and re-investigate. So they basically deduced that the Warren Commission was compromised And that's why the House Select Committee on Assassinations was formed. What an absolute waste of time. I'm sure everyone on the Warren Commission didn't know that. Maybe they did, I don't know. HCSA, House Select Committee on Assassinations, openly aspired to make the Warren Report persuasive. So that's no better. They're trying to just validate the information that the Warren Commission put out there. I don't know. Let's see what it says. Its final 5-volume reporting, arriving in 1979 after 2.5 years and $5.4 million in taxpayer money. That's 70s money. $5.4 million. Why does it cost that much? Like, I don't know what they're spending the money on. Does anyone know? Why does it cost $5.4 million to investigate something? Maybe I'm naive. I have no idea. Okay, after $5.4 million in taxpayer money, it did just the opposite. Based on new ballistic evidence of a second gunman in Dallas, the HSCA rejected the Warren Commission's finding that Oswald had acted alone. There was a probable conspiracy, it announced, to assassinate the president. Okay, so maybe they wanted to corroborate the Warren Commission, but they just couldn't do it due to the evidence that they found. The committee had to be measured. It didn't identify any potential co-conspirators in the president's murder. A few years later, freed of their congressional restraints, the committee's G. Robert Blakey and Richard Billings published The Plot to Kill the President, an unmuzzled account of the investigation. That might be a good read. The murder of Oswald by Jack Ruby had all the earmarks of an organized crime hit, an action to silence the assassin so he could never reveal the conspiracy, they wrote. Jack Ruby, working for the mob, after stalking Oswald for 2 days, silenced him forever. This was a deliberate gangland killing. Now, I did hear somewhere, I read somewhere that shooting in the stomach is kind of a gang type execution. I don't know where I read it. I read and listen to so many things on this topic that I couldn't possibly figure out where I heard it from, but I remember someone saying that that was sort of a gangland type execution. Maybe because it's so painful and slow. I don't know. I don't remember. I shouldn't have even brought it up because I can't source it for you. I just remember hearing that at one point. The co-authors saw no evidence implicating the CIA, but they remained suspicious. Well, I wonder if they knew about Helms and Jolly West's involvement, or they're being employed by the CIA. I don't know. It doesn't say so far. Maybe it'll bring it up. Let's see. Their suspicions were borne out in the hulking 27-volume appendix of the HSCA witnesses' published testimony, which described behind-the-scenes maneuvering by Dulles and Helms to obstruct the Warren Commission. Okay, so at least they know that Dulles and Helms were the weak links in the Warren Commission. 2 at least, maybe there's more. Along with the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, Dulles and Helms were determined to present Oswald as a crazed lone assassin and Ruby as a distraught citizen. Hoover released the FBI's initial findings just 2 weeks after the killing, concluding that Oswald acted alone. Hoover lied his eyes out, the Warren Commission's Hale Boggs later testified in HSCA hearings. On Oswald, on Ruby, on their findings, the bullets, the gun, you name it. So here's an interesting thing about Hale Boggs. I may have mentioned this in a previous episode, but his daughter, y'all know Cokie Roberts. She was like a pretty famous, gosh, I'm going to butcher it. She was a TV personality, whatever, news type, 60 Minutes type person, I think. 60 Minutes, maybe, I don't know. Anyways, Hale Boggs was her dad, and he went down in some mysterious plane crash, I believe in Alaska, probably because of his knowledge or his questioning of the official, or some of these people that you just couldn't cross, I guess. Dulles was no less complicit. He'd urged the Warren Commission to limit itself to reviewing the FBI's investigation rather than mounting its own. Okay, let me read that again. He'd urged the Warren Commission to limit itself to reviewing the investigation. So he doesn't want any further investigation to be done, basically. Just go by the FBI's investigation. That's what it's saying. Dulles is an evil guy, too. Was. In secret, he met with Helms and other CIA officials to coach them on what questions the commission planned to ask. Faced with these revelations, the HSCA could only conclude that intelligence groups were hiding their links to Oswald and Ruby, if not a CIA effort to assassinate Castro. Some believe that the plot on Castro may have been turned on Kennedy after his Bay of Pigs invasion failed, and he embraced other policy changes that curtailed the agency's influence. Well, yeah, he said he wanted to break the CIA into a million pieces and scatter it to the wind. Kennedy said that prior to his assassination. And he embraced other policy changes that curtailed the agency's influence, like reducing the U.S. presence in Vietnam, warming diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and decreasing military spending. Even President Johnson had his doubts. The president felt that the CIA had something to do with the plot, said an Oval Office memo from 1967. Well, that's Johnson covering his own butt. But if you think about it, if Project Chaos and COINTELPRO, their aims were to squash the anti-war movement, aka the hippies, and Kennedy wanted to reduce its presence in Vietnam and warm up to the Soviet Union and decrease military spending. I mean, you could make an argument there that that would be a motive for some. There's so many motives, that's the problem. That's why we'll never get to the bottom of it. The CIA wanted to shut Ruby up. What was it that he had on it? Bert Griffin, an attorney for the Warren Commission, appeared before the HSCA to say that he and his partner had nearly confirmed Ruby's ties to gun-running schemes by anti-Castro Cubans who were shipping arms from the United States to Cuba in hopes of deposing the dictator. At the time, Griffin had no idea that the CIA sponsored these gun-running schemes. In March 1964, when Ruby was weeks away from his examination by Jolly West, Griffin and his partner approached Richard Helms, requesting all the information the CIA had on Ruby. They believed it was possible that Ruby was involved in illegal dealings with Cuban elements who might have had contact with Oswald. Helms offered only a curt reply. The CIA would be very limited in its possibility of assisting. Griffin was baffled. This was someone who was supposed to be helping him. He appealed again. By the time Helms mustered a response, months had passed and West had long since paid his fateful visit to Ruby. An examination of agency files, Helms wrote, has produced no information on Jack Ruby or his activities. Well, there were some, I don't know if it was a prostitute, I think it was a prostitute, that had gotten thrown out of a vehicle or something. Gosh, like I said, I've watched too many things to know where I saw this, but so many people that had info ended up dying in mysterious ways. But she had said that she had seen Oswald at the Carousel Club, which was owned by Jack Ruby, sitting with him and talking. So basically making a tie between them. So I don't know. Like I said, the JFK assassination is a never-ending trail of, or web of rabbit trails. So I need to just, chill. Okay. As for Jolly West, he did his part to keep Ruby untainted from any whiff of conspiracy. As the Warren Commission tried to divine Ruby's motive, West sent a confidential letter to Earl Warren himself, a copy of which I discovered in the HSCA files, dated June 23rd, 1964, and addressed to my dear Mr. Chief Justice. West's note contends that his examinations of Ruby gave him unique insight into the man's motivations for the murder. This despite the fact that West had said Ruby was positively insane. He was confident that Ruby had acted in an irrational and unpremeditated manner when he shot Oswald. wanting to prove that the Jews, through himself, loved their president and were not cowards. Moreover, West asserted that Ruby had never seen Oswald in his life, which, again, that prostitute's told a different story, before his involvement in the Kennedy assassination broke. Without consent from his patient or his patient's lawyers, West was offering confidential medical assessments tailored to political ends. Please let me know if there's anything else that I can do to be of assistance, he added. Warren didn't. In an internal note, he dismissed the psychiatrist as an interloper, writing, "I see no need to do anything with this material." Had he known of West's CIA connections, he may have reacted differently. Yeah, he most likely would have. If West couldn't foist his version of events onto the Warren Commission, he could at least make sure that no compromising information about Ruby emerged. At his urging, a psychiatrist named Dr. Werner Tuteur, Tuteur, sorry guys, I'm butchering that one, examined Ruby in July 1965 to prepare for an upcoming hearing on his sanity. Tuteur submitted a 12-page report to West. It was there in his files, bundled with an edited version that West had submitted to the court. He struck just one passage, the most vital. There is considerable guilt about the fact that he sent guns to Cuba, Tuteur had written. He feels he helped the enemy and incriminated himself. They got what they wanted on me. Erasing those lines, West expunged the very evidence Griffin had been looking for. Is that not a crime to tamper with other people's documentation? Surely is. But again, it's whitewashing history and taking out things that might be damning or might have someone looking down a trail that they don't want them going down. West kept meticulous notes on the Ruby case, all dutifully filed. As investigators, scholars and journalists struggled to piece together the puzzle. He watched from afar, compiling records for his own book about Ruby. He never ended up writing it, but he paid close attention to an exhaustive 1965 volume, The Trial of Jack Ruby, by John Kaplan and John R. Waltz. They wrote, "The fact is that anybody knows why Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald, and this includes Jack Ruby." So basically, nobody knows, especially Jack Ruby, which makes you think, okay, maybe he was kind of a Manchurian candidate type where he just somehow got programmed to do it. I don't know, guys. I know it sounds crazy, but nothing sounds crazy anymore, does it? Jolly West had jotted down that line with a note to himself. Good quote. It was until now the closest he ever came to receiving public credit for his work. All right, there's just one more piece in chapter 11, but I gotta go pick up my daughter from her cross country. But what do you guys think? I mean, this is just more of the same on the corruption of the CIA, but it brings in Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, and basically says the Warren Commission was trash. Their report was trash. After who knows how much, if they spent $5.4 million on the HSCA, how much was spent initially with put on the Warren Commission's investigation? Probably similar, who knows, probably more. Taxpayer money, and there were basically spies within the ranks of the Warren Commission. It's interesting. I've thought about buying a copy of the Warren Commission report, but if I'm being honest, I don't know if I'm going to read it. It's like that thick. It's really huge. I did buy a book though called The Assassinations, and it's about MLK, RFK, Malcolm X, and JFK. But it reads like a textbook too. I thought maybe I would do it on this channel, but I think it would put you all to sleep. It's fascinating stuff to me, but yeah, it's kind of like, it'd be sort of like I don't want to say as dry as like a college course, because that's not every college course is dry. But anyways, I thought about doing it, but I could show it to you guys and see what you think. But like I said, not too many have been. Some of you have been enjoying this book, and I know I've been taking my sweet time getting through it. But if anyone's interested in it, I'll put a picture of it here. Y'all can. I think I got it on eBay for, I don't know, 15, 20 bucks. But you know, and it does have a lot about like the church committee, which everything I find myself reading about any of this stuff in the that happened in the Cold War era, I feel like the church committee is always mentioned. So I really do want to investigate that a little bit more, because I think they're the ones that figured out all of these, or a lot of the corruption, a lot of the bad stuff that the CIA was doing. So at some point, hey, on my long list of things to do and read about, maybe I'll do a little thing on that too, if you guys are interested. All right, I'm gonna let you guys go. Thanks again for watching. You guys are the best. Okay, bye.